Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. I am your host, Chris George Zuger, and you have entered the Den of Lore. Pull your chair up to the fire, grab your glass of coffee because it's 7 o'clock in the morning here on the Eastern Seaboard. And because we're going to learn some cool stuff tonight, courtesy of one of the world's greatest historians, Mr. David Rohl. And again, if you like the show and want to support independent broadcasting, support us at patreon.com/Den of Lore, and for as little as $1 a month, you can ensure that this free show stays free of obnoxious ads from random companies trying to sell you the latest snake oil. Now, there's a ton of perks to be on the show, such as a shout out from the top of the program, and this week I'd like to be able to thank Pat from Brooklyn, our den mother Ellen, Mrs. Fox, Joshua Maddock, Sharon Stewart, and Shafa. And as always, or I should say as normally as always, we normally have a segment at the top of the program. I am actually to be cutting that segment out because we have a lot of information to get through, and if we can't get through it all, well, we may just need to do a second show. So I am going to quickly welcome our guest onto the program, Mr. David Rohl. Let me just get you onto the hard camera here. David, how are you doing this morning or this afternoon you are?
I'm doing great, yeah. Afternoon, Chris, and it's actually morning to you and afternoon here. Yes, you're right. So all our UK and European people will be probably just having their lunch about now.
They are. That was kind of the idea that they had said that I can actually watch the program this morning instead of the usual midnight. And,
absolutely, yeah.
The benefits of a 6-hour time difference.
Absolutely. I love the Persian cat.
Yes, she is quite...
Is she a Russian blue or a Persian?
She's Russian blue.
Ah, okay.
Very, very vocal, very, very loving. She's kind of the mascot of the program.
Her timing was perfect.
Hers, yes. She knows I'm on the show. She actually she broke into the studio by opening my sliding door that I have locked, which I don't know how she did, but she just wanted to be part of the show.
Great.
So today's subject, this is a subject that you have had multiple or at least several lectures on over the last year or so, and I know that it's not necessarily something that has been widely discussed on any of your specials, which is with regards to your research on early Christianity and the Holy Grail. And
right. It's not my normal subject, of course. My normal subject is ancient Egypt and the Bible, but I love legends, and I like to explore legends and see what the historical basis of those legends are, and that's really what this is all about.
Well, those are some of the most widely known legends, especially when we're talking about early Christianity. The Bible obviously has billions of copies printed worldwide, followed by Christianity is followed by a billion people, a billion followers all around the world. So it's a legend, a story, a myth, historical fact. It's something that is very widely known, if not one of the most widely known legends on the planet today.
That's true. I would say, though, that you have to treat the Bible the same way you treat any ancient document. It was written in the ancient world. There's no reason why we should treat it as a special document. There's no reason to believe that it's any less real than any other ancient document we have. You have to do what you do with any document. You have to test it against the factual evidence, the archaeological evidence, the contemporary written evidence, and if it comes out okay, then you can trust it. If it doesn't, then you dismiss it.
Mm-hmm. And, there is a lot of, I'm going to say, not necessarily contradictions, but there are a lot of historical facts that don't necessarily coincide with the information that's out there, and a lot of that is because it was so long ago, and the records don't necessarily match up with the myth, and the myth itself has been interpreted and translated so many times.
That's true. I wouldn't call them myths, though. I think there's a big difference between myths and legends. Myths are sort of like the invention of the fertile mind, whereas a legend is a sort of elaboration upon something that actually happened in history. So you have a basis of history within legend, whereas myth is something more about dragons and things like that. It's an invented idea. A legend is something a little bit more solid. Like Marilyn Monroe, for instance, is a legend. That doesn't mean she didn't exist.
This is true. Now, the historical...
You're thinking about that?
Well, again, I wasn't born around that time, so But yes, no, there is actual indisputable proof and video evidence that she has existed.
Your screen is frozen for me.
My screen is frozen? Oh, you're coming through nice and clear on my side, so must just be a glitch in the intertubes. Now, speaking of, like, one of the biggest myths is the location of the actual crucifixion. I know that this was kind of a starting point, or at least one good starting point, is the location, because the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has the Mount of Golgotha on it, which is supposed to be the traditional site of the crucifixion, but there are a multitude of differing sites and opinions on what site may actually be the proper location for that crucifixion.
Sure. I mean, there really are two main candidates, I suppose. You have the Holy Sepulchre, and you also have this thing called the Garden Tomb, which a lot of evangelical Christians go to when they go to Jerusalem. Not necessarily because they believe it's the actual place, but it creates the atmosphere that you would imagine for Christ's burial, whereas the Holy Sepulchre is a bit of a supermarket full of people. I mean, it's just a heaving mass of humanity when you go there, unless you're very lucky to go on a very quiet period. So you don't really get the great atmosphere in the Holy Sepulchre, but the Garden Tomb has this sort of more spiritual aspect to it, and it's attractive to a lot of evangelical Christians. Though neither of those places are correct, though, as far as I'm concerned. We have a new candidate now, which has been looked at by a number of scholars, and it's very, very fascinating. It ties in a great deal more with the Old Testament and the reasons why Christ would have been executed on this particular spot, and why he was buried close by. And it's not to the west of the temple, and it's not to the north of the temple. It's actually to the east of the temple. And I suppose the best way I could demonstrate that is visually, if I can do that. Can I share my screen, and I'll put on a few pictures so you can actually see what I'm talking about? Would that be okay?
You can. I have you on the big monitor, so you're prepped and good to go.
Let me see if I can actually find a way to do that. I'm going to say I can't actually find. Oh, there we go. I can see my share now. Share screen. Let's see if this works. So, can you see my screen now?
I can.
Everybody else see it? Good. Well, let's just look at a couple of images here. The first one, obviously, is to see the date. We're looking around AD 28. So this is what Jerusalem looked like around that period. You've got the Garden Tomb is up to the north there, to the north of the temple, and the Holy Sepulchre is to the west, as you can see by that arrow. Neither of those are really in the right location. The place that everybody's looking, no, not everybody, but a number of scholars are looking now, is over in the Mount of Olives, and there's good reasons for that. So if we go to the reason why the Garden Tomb has been so popular over the years is because, of course, of Gordon, General Gordon, who actually was in Jerusalem in 1882-83, and he wrote a book on the subject, and he chose this particular place. If I go into full screen here, you can see he was actually sitting on the balcony of his hotel north of the Damascus Gate, and he was drinking his gin or whatever his favourite tipple was, and he saw this. And he saw that looked very much like a skull to him, and I'm sure that's what everybody thinks it is. But when you get up close, it doesn't actually look like that. And so the name Golgotha, which is mentioned in the Bible, which means the skull, it was an obvious link. But of course, Golgotha or Golgotha is an Aramaic word, and it does mean skull, but it also means cranium. It's a different idea entirely. If we go to the word Calvary, that comes from Latin calvaria, which is the translation of the Greek cranion. Now, cranion is where we get our word cranium from. So, in fact, most of these texts, these ancient texts, including the Aramaic, are referring to a cranium rather than a skull. And a cranium is the top of your head, the top of the skull. So we're looking for an entirely different shape. We're not actually looking for something that looks like a skull. And if you go into the Garden Tomb and you look at the burial site, it's very clear that they are not table burials, which you would expect from the time of Jesus. They're actually sarcophagi, or much, much earlier sarcophagi from an earlier period. So the archaeological date for this complex here is 10th century BC, which is a lot earlier, obviously 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. So it doesn't work. So if we look at the Temple Mount itself, and here's the model that you find if you go to the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, this is the model you see there, and you'll notice there's a gate placed in this model, which is immediately to the east of the temple itself, that is the Temple of Herod. Well, that gate doesn't exist. I mean, nobody's ever found a gate there at all. There was no central gate in the Eastern Wall. In fact, if you look at it today, the only gate we have in the Eastern Wall is what we call the Golden Gate or the Eastern Gate. And if you look at that and you compare the distances from where the Dome of the Rock is, where the presumed temple site was, that's where most people put it, and you have the Golden Gate. In fact, we're talking about a very, very long distance in terms of meters. It's about 110 meters to the north. So it doesn't line up at all with the temple. And that meant that people were beginning to look at this possibility of actually locating the temple somewhere else. And Professor Asher Kaufman came up with a theory which I think is very solid. We look at the Temple Mount today on a plan. You have all these main features. You have the Alaska Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and the Golden Gate. And you can see the misalignment between the Golden Gate and the Dome of the Rock there. What Asher Kaufman did was place the Herod's Temple there, which is to the north of the Dome of the Rock. But you'll see it doesn't line up at all with the Golden Gate. It's just to the lineup is just to the south of the Golden Gate. And interestingly enough, that Golden Gate, of course, is fairly late. So the Holy of Holies that you see in that temple lineup there is actually a location on the Temple Mount which a lot of people ignore. It's this place called the Dome of the Tablets, the Kopel Aloha. And that is actually, it means the Dome of the Tablets, and it covers a part of the Temple Mount where it's actually the foundation or the rock surface is beneath that dome. It's one of the few places that you actually see the rock surface there. And if you go due east from there, past the Golden Gate, you end up on the Mount of Olives with that church spire up there. So it's all aligned for something quite different. And so we go to Professor James Tabor's work. And what he did was he also brought to attention the fact that an explorer called James Fleming discovered the original Eastern Gate in 1969, which wasn't exactly where the Golden Gate was. It's actually slightly to the south. And he was wandering around there after a storm, and he fell down a hole, and he found the arch of the old gate, the old Eastern Gate, with bones actually all under the surface there. And that was the original gate, the Solomonic Gate, that would have gone and would have been used in Herod's time, which is exactly aligned with that alignment we showed you with the temple location. So it's slightly to the south of the Golden Gate. There's your Golden Gate on an old black and white photograph, and it takes us well up the Mount of Olives. The actual Garden of Gethsemane is too low to be the site of the garden because it's well below the temple itself. It's actually down in the Kidron Valley. That's not where it should be. So if we put our locations here, there's the Garden of Gethsemane, and there is that little dome, the Dome of the Tablets, which would be the Holy of Holies of both the Herodian Temple and the Solomonic Temple. And we see the Golden Gate there. Look where the due east is. It runs directly to the south of the Golden Gate, where that older gate is located, and it takes us to another olive garden, which is higher up the Mount of Olives. And right next to that is a very important location, which many people don't go to. It's something called the Chapel of the Ascension, and it's supposedly the place where Christ rose to heaven after the crucifixion, obviously. So they're all integrated to this eastern axis of the original Solomonic Temple, and that's where the strength of the argument is. Did the ascension take place at the site of the crucifixion? Most likely it did. And this is where it comes into the really important stuff, which is the Roman laws on execution, which very few people will be aware of. First law, an execution by crucifixion for enemies of the state should take place at the scene of the crime. So in other words, where was Jesus' crime that he was convicted of? And that was when he came down the Mount of Olives on the donkey to enter, on Palm Sunday, to enter the temple. The second, so there's what you've got. It's Palm Sunday, coming to the temple, down that hill, from the top of the hill down into the temple. And he came from Bethany, which we know is located on the other side of the Mount of Olives, which is to the east. And then the other law that we have is an execution by crucifixion should take place at the scene of the arrest. Where was the arrest? Well, the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. So both of these Roman laws focuses on the Mount of Olives and that particular location. So the arrest took place at the Garden of Gethsemane. So everything is pointing to the fact that that's where the Romans would have made the execution, the crucifixion, and therefore the tomb of Jesus must be very close by. So I'll come out of this now so we can talk again. That's the basic theory behind it. And if I get back to sharing, take the sharing off now. let's see if you can still see me again. How's that now?
It's perfect.
So that's the general argument about where the crucifixion took place. And interesting enough, if you stand on that location and you look back towards the temple, you can actually see where Herod's temple would have been located, the facade of it. And one of the most interesting aspects of the crucifixion is it says when Jesus died that they looked towards the temple, and the curtain that was hanging in front of the gate, the door of the temple, was rent asunder or torn in two. Now, you can only see that from the Mount of Olives. You can't see that from the Garden Tomb. You can't see it from the Holy Sepulchre, both of the other locations for Calvary or for Golgotha. So it seems that this cranium-shaped hill, the Mount of Olives, is what they're referring to as the location of the crucifixion. And right nearby is a tomb, very, very close by, with one of those rolling stones that come over the entrance and with a standard 1st century AD burial inside. So that is much more likely to be the place where Jesus was buried.
And what has the consensus been from other researchers as far as this possibility?
Well, it's mainly James Tabor's work in terms of the location, and Kaufman for the location of the temple, which the two tie in together. It's that whole idea of the Eastern axis, the resurrection takes place there, the ascension takes place there, at the place where the sun rises and lights the temple in the mornings. And that is all about this whole idea of Yahwism, which is the light which enters into the Holy of Holies. And it seems to be all fitting together theologically as well as factually on the basis of Roman law. And so the crime is coming from Bethany, and the arrest is coming from Gethsemane, and they are both located on the Mount of Olives.
And what about the cup that was used in the Last Supper? Is this something that you've looked into?
Yes, absolutely. I was interested in this before I moved to Spain, but of course, when I came to Spain, I was able to do a lot more research on the subject by going to the various places that are mentioned in the Grail tradition. Now, people think, oh, well, hang on a minute, it's an Arthurian tradition. But actually, there's a very, very powerful Romano-Spanish tradition about the Holy Grail, which is quite different to the British one, the old British Arthurian legend. And so I've been looking into that, and we have a lot of solid evidence for that. Part of it is legend, part of it is tradition, but then at a certain point in history, it starts to become much more factual and historically based. We have documentation, we have references in Tacitus, for instance, the Roman historian, and all sorts of other evidence that brings us to the conclusion that the Grail was in fact a cup. It's not the Mary Magdalene idea, although Mary Magdalene does play a part in the story. The Grail still remains to be the cup of the Last Supper, which again, on another tradition, supposedly the blood of Christ was collected off the cross by Joseph of Arimathea using the same cup. The question is, of course, that Last Supper, where did it take place? We know it was in a building in Jerusalem, but who owned that building? It's never mentioned in the New Testament as to who owned the building, and it's very likely it would have been someone that Jesus knew, that was a close ally, friend, perhaps a relative even. And it just so happens that Joseph of Arimathea was Jesus' great uncle. He was the brother of the father of Mary. So he was a very wealthy tin merchant, and he would have had a residence in Jerusalem, and he was a very strong supporter of Jesus. So it looks like maybe the cup that was presented to Jesus for him to use at the Last Supper was some of the best household crockery, if you like, of Joseph of Arimathea in his Jerusalem residence. And so I looked into that, and the best candidate for that particular cup is one that was actually made in that era, in the 1st century AD, and that's the famous Santo Calice, which is now in Valencia Cathedral, which is a red agate cup, and it's a very simple cup. Today it's adorned with Byzantine gold chalice, metalwork, and jewelry, semi-precious stones. But in the 1st century AD, it was a simple red agate stone cup. Agate is a translucent stone, so if you put a candle inside it, you can see through it. It's a very beautiful, simple thing, and we know it was made somewhere in the Middle East, possibly Alexandria, possibly Damascus, possibly Antioch, one of those locations where the craftsmanship that we see in that cup, it's been tested and looked at by specialists, have agreed that it is first century and it was made in the Middle East. So it fits the bill as being the sort of thing that Joseph would have had in his household, and the type of thing that Jesus might have used. And it has a tradition. It's a long tradition. First of all, it starts in Britain with Joseph bringing that cup to Glastonbury. Obviously, if he was the owner of the building and it was his cup that he presented to Christ, then it would have been him who possessed it, who had that relic all the way through. And we all know the tradition of Joseph coming to Glastonbury with the so-called Holy Grail. What happens to it after that is the interesting part, and that's another story. But somehow or other, from there, in this tradition, it ends up in Rome. And when we get it to Rome, then that cup starts to become historical. We have documentation for it, and that's the sort of thing we can get into more detail. Although I can tell you the story of how it got to Rome, according to the legends, according to tradition, according to British tradition, and it does tie in very nicely with reports from people like Gildas, the famous British monk historian of the 5th, 6th century AD, who actually mentions Joseph coming to Britain at that time. And he says it was in the 37th year of Tiberius, the Emperor Tiberius. And we know exactly what year that was. So we can tie all that in with a chronology of the period. So we can look at some visuals for that if you like, or you can ask me questions and we can go through it in more detail.
Well, I'd say let's look at some visuals because we do have this fantastic internet connection that's working today. So
all right, okay. Well, let me pop up some more material then for you to look at, and it's coming through clear, is it for you?
It's coming through nice and clear.
Okay. Well, let's just share screen again, and I'll take you to. Let me take you through to a place where we can start this story. I'll skip the Mary Magdalene stuff. I can do that later on if you like. Let's take you to Glastonbury. So this is the story of Joseph Arimathea, and what I'll do is I'll quickly go through this with you.
Although I'm seeing you, I'm not seeing the visuals.
Oh, you're not? Okay, hang on a minute. Wonder why that is. I didn't start sharing. I'm sorry, it's my fault. Can you see my screen now?
I cannot.
Okay, try again. Now?
There we go.
Okay, let's go back to play here. So we're talking about a date of around AD 37. Okay, that's when this is all kicking off. Joseph arrived in England about a year after landing in Provence with Mary Magdalene. I can go back to that story if you want to deal with it. He built a wattle and daub chapel dedicated to Mary Magdalene at Glastonbury, which is part of the British legend. Joseph brought the Holy Grail with him to Britain, again part of the legend, and began converting the Britons to Christianity. Now that's really as far as our story goes with Joseph. We don't know any more after that. The Grail disappears from British tradition. But we can trace it through a particular line of British kings. So this is AD 37. This is the later chapel that was built on the wattle and daub version that Joseph built in Glastonbury. And even in Gildas, as I mentioned earlier, this is what Gildas said about it. And he's our early medieval historian, British historian. He says, the light of Christ shone in Britain in the last year of Emperor Tiberius. And that is AD 37. And that's exactly the year that we have the chronology of Joseph coming to Britain with the chalice or with the cup. So it ties into what Gildas says very nicely. Now what happens is that he actually converts the British king at the time, who was called Bran, and he's later referred to as Bran the Blessed because he was the first Christian king, convert of Joseph. Now Bran marries Anna, who is the daughter of Joseph of Arimathea, and he converts to Christianity. So we have a family tie-in now, and we're going to trace that family tree. So if we go on, it's not, for some reason, not working. Oh, there we go. Now, interestingly enough, if any Americans or Canadians have been to the Tower of London, you'll know that there are ravens in the Tower of London. The famous tradition is that if the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, England will fall. Well, the word raven is the same word in Celtic as Bran. In fact, Bran means raven. And the legend says that his head is actually buried in the mound under the Tower of London, that green patch you can see behind the keeper there, the beefeater. So there is a legend, a British legend, a very ancient one, that goes to this whole idea of the first Christian king of Britain having a relationship with Joseph Arimathea. And you can see this family line here. If you've got Joseph, Arimathea there, who marries an Anna. There's lots of Annas in this story. He is the brother of Joachim. And Joachim and Anna are the parents of Mary the Virgin, who is, of course, the mother of Jesus. Now, on the other side, you have Joseph and Anna. Anna and Joseph give birth to a daughter called Anna, who marries Bran the Blessed. And they give birth to a son called Caradoc. And he marries another Anna. Now, Caradoc is a very key to this whole story, really, because Caradoc himself has 3 children. 2 of them are going to follow through this story. One is called Lyn, his son. The other one is called Gladys. And Gladys is an ancient Celtic word. It means princess. And those 2 figures actually end up in our story a bit further down the road. But if we follow the Grail legend, the Grail starts with Joseph of Arimathea. Oops, that shouldn't have happened. Let me go back. Just take that back one. I'll just put those in again. I don't know why it did that automatic, but sometimes it plays up. I'm just setting it all up for you again. So here is our family tree, and there is the Grail legend as it comes through the British story. So you start with Joseph of Arimathea. He comes to Britain. He converts Bran, who is then handed the cup. So it's in the hands of the British kings now. And Bran's son-in-law, Caradoc, who is his successor, is the holder of the cup, and he passes it to his son Lyn. Now, that guy Lyn is the key to what happens when we get to Rome a little bit later on. So we have this tradition, and Caradoc is the famous figure in history called Caratacus by the Romans. So when the Romans invade Britain, he is actually the Pendragon, or the main king of Britain. He's one of the Catavellauni tribe, whose capital is at Verulamium, which is St. Albans today. And he has a famous battle with the Romans when they arrive under their emperor, which is Claudius. Now, you don't need to know all this stuff. I'll go through it quickly. This is the line that we have of the British kings. And they come from they descend from a king called Lud. And he is about the 4th generation before Caradoc. Now, Lud is where we get our name London from. So Ludgate, or Ludgate Circus in London, is named after this King Lud. So he's a historical figure. And you can see there are even coins of some of these guys. And if we tie them into the Joseph line, you can see here that King Bran's son is King Lear, and he's the famous King Lear of Shakespeare. And they come down to Caradoc, and Caradoc has these two children called Gladys, who later becomes Claudia in Rome, and Lyn, who becomes Linus in Rome, because they all end up in Rome. What happens is that I'll go through this very quickly, that when Claudius sends his generals over to invade Britain in 43 AD, he attacks the Brits, who are based in Verulamium, as I say, which is St. Albans. And Claudius's general, which is called Aulus Plautius, invades Britain about that time. And he defeats Caradoc, who then he flees to Wales. And then in AD 50, the wife and children of Caradoc are captured. This is actually the site of the battle in Church Stretton in Shropshire. And we have an English hill fort on top of that hill there, just called Caer Caradoc, or the Fortress of Caradoc. Now we're in AD 50. So what happens is Caradoc is then taken in chains to Rome. He's first of all he escapes the battle, but he's then turned in by Queen Cartimandua, who is the Brigantes queen, if you like. She actually turns him over to the Romans, and he's taken to Rome. And his son and daughter are also taken there. So we have them all now in Rome. He's about to be executed in the Forum, but then he's allowed to speak to the emperor Claudius and the Senate. You know, normally they garrote a king who rebels against the Rome, but in this particular case, because we have a very wise emperor, Claudius is probably the only one in this period, and he actually says, "Okay, I'll listen to what you have to say." So the guy makes a famous speech. Now that speech is recorded in Tacitus, and of course we're now into Roman history. And this is the speech of Caradoc. Tacitus actually records it in his works. And this is what Tacitus says that Caradoc, called Caratacus in Rome, this is what he says to the emperor. "If you Romans choose to lord it over the world, does it follow that the world must accept slavery? If I had surrendered immediately, neither my fall nor your triumph would have become famous. My punishment would have been followed by oblivion. Whereas if you now save my life, I shall be an everlasting memorial to Roman clemency. So he's very clever. He's appealing to Roman justice and this benevolent emperor, and he gets off with it. He doesn't get killed. Instead of that, he gets given a palace in Rome. He has to live in exile, but he ends up now in Rome. So Caraticus and family are given a palace in exile on Viminial Hill within the walls of Rome. The residence is actually called, and recorded as called, Palatium Britannicum, which means the British Palace. Caraticus's daughter, Gladys, is officially adopted by the Emperor Claudius, and so she actually becomes Claudia. She's named after Claudius, and she's very famous in ancient Roman literature. She's called Claudia Peregrina, which means Claudia the Foreigner, or Claudia the Foreigner. So there you on that point there. So these British exiles are the first Christians in Rome, because remember, they've been converted by Joseph. So this whole British line leading up to this point are British Christians. So the first Christians in Rome are actually from Britain. This is before Paul arrives. This is before Peter possibly arrives. So Caraticus's son Lynn, whose name is Linus in Rome, becomes the first bishop of Rome, appointed by Paul. So when Paul arrives, according to Irenaeus, he appoints Linus as the first bishop, not Peter. St. Peter was not the first bishop of Rome. In fact, none of the apostles were ever bishops. What they did was they traveled around the ancient world, converting people to Christianity, and they appointed locals as the bishops, and they moved on to the next city. That's exactly what happened in Rome. What happened was Paul arrived in Rome. There were already these Britons in Rome, living in Rome in this British palace. The son called Linus, who had the cup of Christ, who owned the cup of Christ, was the obvious candidate to make us the first bishop of Rome, so that he could serve the Mass in Rome using Christ's cup from the Last Supper. That's what gave him the power to be the first bishop of Rome. Peter only comes along later, and he's not the bishop of Rome.
Which is interesting, because Linus has always been seen as the second.
Exactly, but he wasn't. That's only in Catholic tradition, in Vatican tradition, because they obviously want to follow the idea that on this rock I will build my church. In other words, that Peter will be the first bishop of Rome. The reality is, what that statement means by Christ is that St. Peter's, the basilica, will be built on the bones of Peter. On this rock I will build my church. It's a literal statement. It doesn't mean that he was the first bishop of Rome. So the location of that palace, I'll just show you where that is very quickly. You have on the left-hand side there, you have Vatican Hill. And over there on Viminal Hill, you have Palatium Britannicum. And it's actually still there today. It's the oldest basilica in Rome. And it's today called Santa Prudenciana. And it formed and built on top of an ancient Roman villa, and it has the characteristics of a Roman villa. And so this was the place where the first Christians lived in Rome. It's Palatium Britannicum, the British palace, and this is where the family of Claudia, who married a senator called Pudens, or a Roman centurion called Pudens, his father was a senator, and it's from there that we get to Timothy, of course, 2 Timothy, where Paul, having arrived in Rome, writes to Timothy and says, greetings from these people who are already there, the Christians who are already there, including Claudia and Pudens, and including Linus and Eubulus, who becomes the first bishop of Britain. So all these British characters are living in Rome in exile, and they are the place that Paul comes to when he comes to visit Rome. And then he writes back to Timothy, giving greetings from these British people, these British Christians.
That's so fascinating. Like to know that there was a parallel connection.
It's a some people say, okay, it's a British legend, and that's fair enough to argue that, but it's supported by so much evidence. Are we back on screen, by the way?
We are back on screen, yes.
Okay, good. For instance, the Apostolic Constitutions, which are housed in the Vatican archive, supposedly written by Peter, actually say that the first bishop of Rome was the son of a British king. So there you have the Vatican actually saying what really happened, that you have a British king whose son becomes the first bishop of Rome.
And, if this is the case, and at least it lends a lot more credence to that. I know that Tacitus had extensive records. He, the most famous historian of Rome.
Yeah. Absolutely, and so we can be absolutely certain this Caradoc character, the Caraticus, must have come to Rome as a defeated British king, and he brought his family with him, and that's in Tacitus, so we can be sure of that. And so the question is, can we link that to the Joseph Arimathea story of the Holy Grail coming to Britain and how it ended up in Rome? Because the story then moves from Rome to Spain eventually, but then we jump 2 centuries because we have so many bishops of Rome before we get to the point where it has to leave Rome, and that is a very different story then, because we're now into the persecutions against the Christians in the reign of Valerian. So we're in the 3rd century AD, and in this particular period, then the priesthood and the Catholic priesthood or the Christian priesthood, the early Christian priesthood, is being threatened by the Roman emperors, and they have to virtually get this cup of Christ out of Rome because it's going to be confiscated by the emperor. And so we come to the story of an individual called St. Lawrence, or San Lorenzo in Spanish, and he's the guy that's responsible for saving the Grail from destruction, the cup of Christ, which has been used by all the bishops of Rome since Linus's day. So all the way through those 200 years or so, we've had that cup in Rome being used in the Mass, in the early Christian Mass, until the point where we get to Valerian, and then there's a persecution, one of the persecutions of the Christians, and it's the time when we have to get this cup out of the country and get it to safety in Christian Spain, in northern Christian Spain.
Now, how
Whoops.
She just jumped right from a microphone. Oh,
I saw it, yeah.
Now, how about the different accounts, or at least the different segments of Christianity at that time? I know that there are considerable amounts of literature and text that may not necessarily have been considered canon. How have, let's say, the the less orthodox, or let's say the Greek side of Christianity, have looked at the Grail mythos?
I'm not entirely sure about that. The Orthodox or Greek Eastern Christianity, the Grail story, of course, is focused on Western Christianity, on Western Europe. That's where the tradition is. It's not an Eastern one, although, of course, in the Arthurian tradition, we have all sorts of mentions of people, crusaders, and people who are in the East, and we get Arabic names coming along. So there is, don't forget, a connection that we find a meeting point between Christianity and Islam. And where is that? That's in Spain. That's where we get the Moorish conquest of Spain, and we get Christians and Muslims and Jews all living in the Iberian Peninsula at the same time, before we get to Isabel and Ferdinand, who of course kick out the Moors. So that's where we get into this strange tradition of mix that we get in Wolfram von Eschenbach. Especially we get that in the tradition of the Sangreal, the Holy Grail, where we get these strange Arabic names mentioned. We get the mention of the Philosopher's Stone again, which of course is something to do with the Arab world, and it's all tied into the Crusader period, when we get Christians going into the Middle East and mixing with the cultures, learning a lot about the Islamic traditions and Arabic traditions, and they bring them into their thinking, their ideologies, as well as the influence from Islam in Moorish Spain. So we have this. Remember that in Moorish Spain, the Christians and Islam are fighting a lot, but they're also integrating a lot as well. In the story of El Cid, for instance, he has many friends within the Muslim world who were on his side fighting against other Moors. So we get this mixture, this admixture of Arabic tradition and Christian tradition. But the focus of the Holy Grail legend, of course, comes from the Arthurian traditions of Chrétien de Troyes, who's the first guy really to write the stories about the Holy Grail legend. And he, of course, is a Frenchman. So we have the German Wolfram and we have Chrétien, the two of them who are writing the principal romances that we know about from the Christian world about the Holy Grail story. And then that evolves into the Arthurian tradition of later British tradition.
No, there are also several different candidates for the Holy Grail, which I know that there's
Sure.
the Valencia Chalice, which we've discussed. There's the Genoa Chalice. I know that there is also the Doña Urracha, which I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. How are these different candidates being looked at in comparison to?
Well, they all have their advocates, obviously. It depends on which tradition you want to go. If you want to go for the the Vatican tradition, the Catholic tradition, you have to realize that the last two popes before the current one, both of those, when they became pope, the first place they went to on their world travels, guess where? Valencia. Why did they go to Valencia? Because that's where the Santo Caliph is located, and both of them served the Mass with this cup, what we're talking about today, the red agate cup, mounted on the Byzantine gold. So both of those popes had very strong beliefs that this was the cup of Christ. Now, you can dismiss that if you like, but that's the original Catholic tradition, the Vatican tradition. The other ones have not got the same tradition, and also there's the archaeological evidence that the red agate cup was made in the 1st century AD in that area. So it fits the timeline as well. It's not a later addition that's come into the story. It has a pedigree going back to an archaeological period when that type of cup was being made in that area. So it's got its strengths. It's got a lot of strength to it. And when you then pick up the story of it, how it got to Spain from Rome, we're now in documented history. We actually have proper documented history about this cup and how it left Rome under the Valerian persecutions and ended up in Huesca in Aragon in northern Spain, ancient Latin Osca, and it's from there that we have a documented history of what happened to that cup and how it ended up in Valencia.
And I know that we have a little bit of time, and I would get very, very, very angry messages if I didn't go into this with you, which would be Mary Magdalene. Obviously, okay. The Dan Brown story is a very, very good written book, but it may not necessarily be close to the actual truth. So I would like to get your input on this.
Well, I obviously read the original Holy Blood, Holy Grail book well before Dan Brown, and it was very intriguing. And I think I read it when I was fairly young, and I looked into it in great interest with a lot of detail. And of course, the original part of the story, the idea that Mary Magdalene was at least the girlfriend of Christ, if not the wife of Christ, is very powerful. I think that she's much underrated, underestimated in terms of the biblical story. And I think she was a very, very important apostle, a very important person in Jesus' life. She probably came from a wealthy family, so she might have been one of the main sponsors of Christianity in terms of finance, providing funds for the apostles and Jesus when he was traveling around the Holy Land. So she's very influential. Now, there is a very strong tradition, and I'd like to just share again a few bits of information about this that shows that actually she, although she's not the Grail, she was responsible for bringing the Grail with Joseph to the southern France, which is why she's the patron saint of France or Provence. And I'll just pop a few pictures up for you to show you that and how strong that tradition is in France itself. So, first of all, can you see are we back on shared screen again?
We are back on.
Okay. What you're looking at there is the ceiling of a really famous church in Paris called Sacré-Cœur, which is the second most important church after Notre Dame. And on the ceiling, you will see, if you squint it up, and I'm going to actually turn it around and show it you, you can see a group of people arriving in France on a boat. The first three in particular, the most important ones, you can see the prow of the boat and you can also see the sail behind the first three. Now, this is the famous French tradition of the arrival of some of the apostles and their entourage at Saint-Méry-de-la-Mer in southern France. And the first three, their names are actually in their halos. The first one is Lazarus, as you can see. The second one is Magdalena, which is Mary Magdalene. And the third one is Martha, who is the sister of Lazarus. So they're all from Bethany. Well, the two of them are from Bethany, and in the middle of them we have Mary Magdalene. This is the story that we know from the French tradition of them arriving in France. The female members of Jesus' family and some of his male followers departed from Caesarea by boat in the spring of AD 36, 8 years after the crucifixion and following the stoning to death of Stephen, who was the first martyr. They arrived at Saint-Méry-de-la-Mer near Marseille. According to Archbishop Rabanus Maurus, who is a 9th century historian, in the boat were Mary, Martha, and Lazarus of Bethany, the three that are mentioned in the story of the raising of Lazarus, along with Mary Magdalene and a guy called Maximine, who becomes Saint Maximine later, and Joseph of Arimathea, and lots of other Christians as well. Now, they're probably traveling in one of Joseph's boats because he was a tin merchant, and the tradition is that he came to Cornwall and got his tin from that area, so he had a fleet of ships. So then Joseph moved on to Britain, which is the story we've already mentioned about the Glastonbury tradition. But of course, Mary Magdalene remained in Provence, preaching from the hermitage of Saint-Baume until she died in AD 63. So if we look at where that is, there is where Saint Marie de la Mer is located, where they came ashore. There is Marseille, very close by, and we're in Provence now. So the Grotto of Saint-Baume is located in southern Provence. And I actually went there and had a look at the place, and the place where her bones are traditionally buried is in Saint Maximin la Saint-Baume. This is the church of the bishop Saint Maximin, who set up the church there. And the actual cave where she lived for those years past that time is built up in this cliff here, and it's got a monastery in front of it today. But if we dig in a little bit closer, there's the old monastery. And inside is this cave, which is where she is said to have lived out the rest of her life preaching and converting. And in there is a statue of Mary Magdalene. So she died in AD 63, and she was her bones were buried then in this church called Saint Maximin. And if you go down into the vaults beneath the crypt beneath the church, you will see a grill, and there's a skull behind the grill. And sometimes it's taken out, and it's obviously encased in this gold, but the famous long locks of Mary Magdalene. And it's believed to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. Now, that's the French tradition, and it's obviously a very strong tradition. But it doesn't deal with this idea of continuing on to the sort of Dan Brown idea, which I think is not working. I mean, yes, it's possible, entirely possible, that Mary Magdalene had a daughter or a child to Jesus, but the idea of linking that to the Grail legend is something quite different. The Grail is the cup, it's not the person. So that whole Dan Brown thing changes when she transmogrifies into the Grail being Mary Magdalene herself. And of course, yes, we have this idea of sangreal can be sang real, which is the royal blood, as opposed to the cup or the dish. And so we have this link, but the royal blood, of course, is also linked to the idea of Joseph gathering the blood of Christ at the crucifixion in the cup. So it has a connection that way as well. So although I'm perfectly au fait with the idea that that Mary was the mother of Jesus' child, and after all, Jesus was a rabbi, and rabbis should be married in order to be men of the world, in order to do their teachings, I have no problem with the idea that Jesus was a husband, that Jesus had a child, and that child maybe came to Provence with Mary Magdalene. But beyond that, we can't go, as far as I'm concerned. What happens to the Priory of Zion stuff and all that is much, much later, and it's obviously clearly a forgery. It's not a real historical thing. But the part about Mary coming to France, I think, has a very strong basis of tradition behind it.
And what would you think is the significance? Is it more important for people of faith to have this connection to say, okay, well, this actually happened, or is it more important historically to say that this actually happened?
I don't mind. It could be either way. I don't see any reason why a priest, a man of God, cannot be a husband. In fact, I think it's beneficial for somebody who actually is the intermediary between God and you. If you don't want to talk directly to God, if you want to go to the medieval tradition of going through the priest, that the priest should not be a man of the world, and that is the case with rabbis. Well, I have no trouble with that.
Well, I think I was more referring to the legend as a whole, as far as linking the historical points to the particular items that we're discussing, as far as linking that history from the time of the crucifixion to Joseph's arrival in Britain or Mary's arrival in France. Do you think that helps people in terms of faith, or is it that is also important, or do you think that it's important also to link the historical fact to know that it's actually true?
Well, apart from the fact we have mentions in Tacitus even of this person called Jesus, And some people say, okay, that's been added in by the Christian church into the original document and all the rest of it. What you have to realize is that the task of these apostles was to go out and preach the word, the doctrine, the words of Christ. And that is what we find in all the traditions. They go to India, they go to Egypt, they go to Spain, they go to France, they go to Britain. This is what we'd expect to happen. How else would Christianity evolve into the great church it is without that movement? It wouldn't have happened if they'd all stayed in Jerusalem. Jesus' brother, he did nothing. He was stuck in Jerusalem. And so he didn't go out and do any preaching. It was down to Paul and the rest of them to go and do all the preaching. And so it gives you the strength to know that they believed so strongly they were prepared to be martyred. Tells you something about the reality of the history of that era, and that Christ must have been more than just a historical footnote. He must have been much more than that. Getting into the theology of Christ himself, that's a different issue. But these people believed. That's the point about it. And they went out there and they projected that belief on the other people who accepted the stories, and they died for it. Okay, so it's a very, very powerful thing that's going on there, and for it all to be based on nothing is a rather strange thing, I think. I think you have to accept the fact that there's something very special about that man who started this whole thing off. And they had so many followers who went out there and risked their lives literally by going out and preaching to non-believers. And of course, the powers that be would then persecute them and kill them. And that's exactly the story. And it's only until we get to Constantine where things start to change.
Well, at that point, Constantine had just, essentially it started recombining the empire between East and West, and obviously that was a very tumultuous time. And I know that a large majority of the Roman army were made up of Christians. So you can't rule Rome without having support of the army.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that if Paul hadn't gone to Rome, and maybe if those British Christians hadn't gone to Rome, there wouldn't be Christianity today. They had to go to the hub, the equivalent of going to New York today or Washington today. If they hadn't done that, if they hadn't gone to the great Babylon and preached from Babylon itself, there would have been no Christianity today. It was through the Roman Empire that we got Christianity as a worldwide religion.
And I know there's one subject that we didn't necessarily touch on very much, which was the burial site of Peter. Obviously, that is the burial site of the Holy Basilica in Rome. What are your thoughts on that as the actual burial site?
Well, I think it's archaeologically extremely strong. If I can see if I can find something to show you on that. Now, where would that be? That's probably going to be in. Yes, it's in this one here. Let me just fire it up a second. See, I think the visuals help to explain these things better than I can do just by verbally explaining it. So, can you see my screen again?
I can, yes.
Okay, so let's just quickly whip through what's going on here. In fact, I'll just take you straight to St. Peter's. We don't need to have all this early Christian stuff with Prudenziana and Praxedes. There's a lot also on Paul's burial, but let's just deal with Peter. Okay, so Peter is the last one to arrive, really, in this story. And, of course, it's all based on what happened on Vatican Hill. Very famous. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will have been to Vatican and gone through the actual basilica. So he's regarded as the first bishop of Rome, but we've now explained that he probably wasn't. And he was executed upside down in AD 66, according to the latest chronology. He was imprisoned in January AD 67 for 9 months. Sorry, he arrived in AD 66, I beg your pardon. He was imprisoned in January in AD 67 for about 9 months, and he was crucified upside down on the 22nd of February AD 68. That's his martyrdom day. His execution took place near Nero's circus on Vatican Hill. So Caligula and Nero had a circus there, not the one you see today, which is below the Palatine. That's the one is near Vatican Hill. And he was buried right next to a road called Via Cornelia, okay, which is where today we see St. Peter's Basilica. Paul first arrived, on the other hand, in AD 61, so he'd arrived a lot earlier than Peter. And then he went off to Spain, according to the legend. It's not documented, but that's where he writes he's intending to go. In fact, he's calling in to Rome on the way to Spain. And he goes off, and then some people say that he went off to Britain and came back again. Peter arrived, as I say, a lot later, after Paul had already ordained Linus as Bishop of Rome. So he's coming late to the party, as it were. Then Paul was beheaded on January the 25th on AD 67. And Peter then appointed Linus' successor, who was called Clement. Okay, so he's the third bishop. Well, according to Christian tradition, he's the third Bishop of Rome after Peter and Linus, but in fact, we really think he's the second. Peter was then martyred on February the 22nd, AD 68. And then Linus was martyred in AD 76, and Clement took over from him as Bishop of Rome. So that's the chronology of that early period. And you can see that here in the recordings of the Catholic Church, where you have Peter as the first one, then you have Linus, and then Clement is actually Clementus in Latin. So they've abbreviated to Cletus or Cletus, and then he goes on from there. So Paul ordains Linus. Peter arrived in Rome much later. Then Peter cannot be the first Bishop of Rome because there's already a Bishop of Rome when he arrived. Then he never actually appointed anybody, and what I'm trying to say is that the actual apostles themselves, including Paul, they never became bishops of anywhere. That wasn't their job to do that. Their job was to appoint bishops. So when we get to this thing in Matthew 16:18, which basically says, "Upon this rock I will build my church," it's a literal meaning. So here is the Circus of Caligula and Nero. And if you notice where it's located just to the left of this Via Cornelia. And the pagan cemetery was on the other side of the road, just next to Vatican Hill. That's where Peter was buried when he came to Rome. So if we look at the Constantine's Basilica, which you see here in black, it's a very complicated diagram. The red is actually the Renaissance Basilica that we see today. But you'll notice that the Via Cornelia actually runs right through the apse and to the side of the apse, just to the left side or the south side of the high altar today. Okay, so that's where the road, Cornelia Road, was, and therefore the high altar, it marks the spot where the burial of Peter took place. So it's just to the north, and this was constructed in AD 326, the Constantine Basilica. So if you look at the Via Cornelia today, it's still there. It's the main street that leads up to the Vatican, to St. Peter's. And if you go inside, what you see on the left side of that curtain, where that guy in the blue shirt is standing, leaning on it, that's where Via Cornelia ran, along there. And so you see the high altar down the middle is actually just to the right side of that road. And it lies below the great Baldacchino, where you have this dip, this D-shaped well. And inside that D-shaped well, which goes virtually underneath where the high altar is located, there is a little shrine. And the shrine covers a shaft which goes down beneath the high altar. And in this little place, it's where bishops put their bishops who are about to become bishops, they put their mitres in this little recess above the shaft where St. Peter's grave is, to have it blessed before they become bishops the next day. This is called the Pallia Niche, and you can see it there. So all the bishops of Rome, or the popes, are buried behind this photograph in the crypt, and it goes directly towards this shaft that you can see where that figure is located. If we look at a plan, that area, that D-shaped area, is called the Confessio, and there is the Pallia Niche, where the shaft goes down to where St. Peter's grave is located, and behind it is a Clementine chapel. You don't need to worry about that. And right there is a grave which has on the lid of the grave, on the stone lid of the grave, is mentioned a person called Linus, which would appear to be the first Bishop of Rome. That seems to be his burial place, close to where Peter was buried. Remember, he dies after Peter because Peter's executed. So if we look at a cross section now, you can see the big modern, the Renaissance basilica there, and beneath it, the red section, is the vaults where the popes are buried. And to the left side, under the high altar, you see the area with the stairs going down, and the location directly underneath that, which is where St. Peter's grave is located. And below that, in the lower level, is the pagan Roman cemetery of Vatican Hill. And in there, when they excavated it, they actually found a street. So we're going to go and have a look at that quickly. The excavations began in 1939 after the entombment of Pope Pius XI. So when they buried him, they started digging around, and they found that there was this street, if you like, of tombs underneath, and you can see the red there. That is the road just to the south of that, where you get the Via Cornelia, and immediately to the north of it is this cemetery here, which is where Peter was buried. And this is what's underneath St. Peter's today. You can see the street here with the tombs on either side, which are Roman tombs. And the complex we're interested in is this one, which is at the end right underneath the high altar. And there's the Via Cornelia again. And where Peter was buried is right there in AD 68. And above it was a courtyard, a secret courtyard, where the Christians used to come and serve Mass next to Peter's grave. There's various other objects that was found, the most important of which is this red wall here you see, which is the first thing they found when they actually located it. And the Gaius Trophy, which is where the Mass service was held above St. Peter's grave. And then there's a graffiti wall which is built right next to this place, which is the clue that showed us where the actual bones of St. Peter were located. This is what the trophy looked like in ancient times, and it's immediately above the grave. And it's immediately below the high altar. Now, that graffiti wall, you can see on the left-hand side there, is covered in inscriptions, of which one of them is very important, because it says Petrus NE, which means Peter is here. And so they punched a hole in the wall, and they found that inside the wall there was a lined box. And inside that box of line, there was a set of bones covered in a purple cloth with gold thread. Now, purple, as you know, is the emperor's color. So it's something that's regarded as for somebody who's very, very important. And they believe that Peter's bones were moved originally out of his grave and placed in hiding in this wall in order to protect it during a later pogrom or whatever it was, a persecution, to stop them from taking the bones of St. Peter. So to summarize, the bones are found in marble-lined loculus inside the graffiti wall, wrapped in a purple cloth with golden thread. The bones were of a man of his late 60s, which is about right for Peter. He was about 68 when he was crucified. And in June 1968, Margherita Garducci, who is one of the great archaeologists in this project, declared the bones to be those of St. Peter. And that is now the view of the Catholic Church today. So here's a cross-section. You can see here very clearly, you have the current altar there, and you have the floor that you walk on today in the Basilica. And beneath that, you have the burial place of the popes, and you have the original altar of Pope Gregory I. And below that, you have the Gaius Trophy. This is this place where the first masses were held. And right below that is the original grave of Peter right next to the red wall. So all these things are following this idea that on this church, on this rock, I will build my church. Literally, on the bones of Peter, the man, they will build the St. Peter's Church, the center, if you like, of early Christianity. And those bones, some of them, have been placed in this bronze casket in 1969 and are lying in the private apartments of the Pope today. And in fact, our Pope today, Pope Francis, brought them out for the very first time and displayed the box in public on November the 4th, 2013. So it is now acknowledged by the Christian Church, by the Catholic Church, to be the authentic bones of St. Peter. So that's how that all works. I'm glad we managed to get that in.
Well,
Are we back to normal settings?
We're back to normal settings. That's a tremendous amount of information to go through, and it's to know that even 2,000 years later we still have that connection to the past, and this is obviously different than the usual subject matter that I deal with on the show. A little more recent ancient history, but it's still quite fascinating. Just because there is a more recent contemporary legend that is connected to that historical past. So, you feel a little closer to it because you can actually have the verification. So I wanted to thank you very much for bringing us through that.
Well, it's great to do it. And maybe if we do another show, I can tell you the Spanish story behind the Holy Grail. We can continue it then another time.
That would be fantastic.
Perhaps not too distant into the future. Maybe fairly soon.
That would be fantastic. We'll do better than 18 months in between shows.
Yeah. Good. Excellent. Well, it's been lovely to talk to you.
Well, it has been as well. I'm just going to see if I can actually get the main camera switched back here. And as is tradition, I'm going to see if the outro music actually plays. and then I can get us out. It usually takes a second. I originally had done a very, very slow incline on the oh, there we go. It's playing. Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this very early edition of Den of Lore. I know for anybody who's watching on YouTube, the stream did not work. I will have the video uploaded right after the show. And if you're watching on Facebook, again, if you're just catching us now, you can join us afterwards and rewatch it from the beginning. All right, my name is Chris George Zuger. This has been A Morning with Mr. David Roll. Thank you very much all for joining us, and I will see you all next time.